I reacted indeed immediately to the invitation, also because I think that the topic is very relevant practically, but it's also fascinating intellectually. Though I had a hard time understanding what you mean with culture. So I will use it in different ways in the presentation, and I felt also from talking to you and colleagues that you also use it in different ways in the project. And what I want to do is introduce the transition perspective we work with and bring some reflections on the challenges and the aims of MESOC. And maybe how we can think about the roles of researchers and policymakers in supporting the transitions that we want. I heard the word transition, transformation already a couple of times this morning. I don't want to start cynical, but in general, it's often used to talk about change in general, and it's often used as meaning something inherently good. And one of my key messages is that transitions are happening to us and can also cause very disruptive negative effects in society. And the value of culture and diversity and creativity is that we can adapt to and anticipate these transitions so that we come out for the better on the other end. So the question is both, can we understand how transitions evolve, and can we mobilize creative forces to deal with these transitions to move to a just and sustainable future? And like Grazia explained, that requires a combination of thinking and doing. So it's what we do at Drift, my institute, is really combine the academic work from a lot of different disciplines on transitions and what transitions are with experimental action research, some would say activism, on what transitions are. I'll go through the presentation, and indeed, like was said, the chat can be used. I'll do it Dutch style, so I'll go quick, but I also try to stimulate discussion by being a bit direct. So please challenge me in the chat, and I can maybe pick up on that during my presentation. Grazia already introduced my background, but just a few words on my institute. We're part of the Erasmus University in Rotterdam, the Dutch Research Institute for Transitions, DRIFT. In Dutch, it also means drive or anger. And we are, I think, an interesting hybrid organization of transdisciplinary action researchers. So we are like a social enterprise within the university, combining different academic disciplines to work in and with practice. And in the end, I will bring some quick examples. And our philosophy is that as researchers, we can develop knowledge by looking outside of our windows, but to develop actionable and relevant knowledge for society requires co-creation and design-oriented processes in and with society, with policymakers that challenge or that face challenges, with businesses that want to transform how their business model, and with communities. We're part of a global network by now. The network is referred to as Sustainability Transitions Research Network. And a lot of colleagues in Italy are also part of it, a lot of different disciplines. I won't dwell on it, but it combines all sorts of different ways of understanding the dynamics of societal change and translating those insights into action. So there are also a lot of researchers that do more historical research or more descriptive. The disclaimer is that I myself and a lot of colleagues at Drift are more in the experimental and prescriptive mode. So for us, how we sort of work on transitions and sustainability transitions, we adopted or we developed a certain academic mindset that is explicitly normative and critical. So our starting point is often the question, why are things problematic and why are we not solving it? I'll come to it, but there's a lot of persistent challenges. So now we talk about mission-oriented policy, we talk about the big transitions. We talk about them because we're basically failing for decades already in addressing socioeconomic inequalities and ecological destruction. The second point, it doesn't mean that we know that we have these fundamental problems, that we know the solutions. So unlike engineers or economists or maybe some politicians, we don't know what the solutions are, but we need to experiment and find a design-oriented mode of development to experiment our way out of the current problems. And that requires the mobilization of a lot of different types of knowing. So we not call that transdisciplinarity, but it's different academic disciplines, but there's also a lot of knowledge in practice with practitioners, professionals like architects or designers or creators, but also with citizens. So we need to think differently about how we develop knowledge. And we do all this to achieve impact, to contribute to substantial and systemic change in society. There's a lot of different scientific theories behind it. I won't dwell on it. So what does it practically mean? Now we go to the transition narrative. The starting point already 20 years ago, but it's still valid, is the question, why are we unable to escape a pathway of unsustainable development? 40 years ago almost, the world signed agreements in Rio, the Sustainability Declaration, and we started the IPCC and the IPBES, two figures from recent reports from the panel on climate change and on biodiversity. Basically, in the past 40 years, well, we didn't move to a pathway of further escalation, but we're basically on the same trajectory still of increasing carbon emissions in our atmosphere and increasing the rate of biodiversity loss in our ecosystems. So 40 years of discussing sustainable development policies, sustainable development goals. Yes, there was a lot of other types of progress achieved, but in addressing the persistent problems that our pathway of economic development creates, we didn't see any structural results. So basically, and this is what we call persistent unsustainability, we are unable to escape this pathway. And we see the negative impacts, obviously, also at the city or at the local level, in terms of climate change impact, in terms of pollution, in terms of socioeconomic impacts. And these are some pictures from my city, Rotterdam. 10% of the population lives around the poverty line, and we are a so-called developed country with a strong economy. Well, not for everybody, and that's getting worse in the Netherlands. But we also see a lot of health inequalities. We see challenges in the energy system. We have a lot of air pollution and so on. Also here, a lot of policies are made. We know these problems, but we are unable to escape it. So the question, this question of persistency is at the heart of transitions research. And the explanation that you might say we work on as a hypothesis is this concept of a regime in a societal system, in a sector, in an organization. We as humans develop certain dominant ways of thinking, doing, and organizing. We call that, so this is how we use culture, structure, and practices. We develop a certain routine collectively that provides stability to society. So in the energy system, we built big fossil power plants and electricity grids. That's our historical transition. And as consumers, we pay a certain amount, but we also expect the light to go on all the time because a professional sector organizes the energy system. That's a, sort of an example. But also in cities or regions, you can see certain dominant identities, the way we collectively think, the worldview, what we value, what we feel is important. We develop certain structures, institutions, infrastructures, and our behaviors. Social scientists, sociologists would talk about structuration. So think about the mobility system. We've developed a certain urban fabric with roads, with parking spaces. People have bought their own car. So we have a very individual mobility system that is also based on fossil fuels with gas stations. And there are all sorts of regulations around it. And people working in these sectors, they generally try to improve and optimize the system. We might have a traffic jam, so we try to organize the traffic in a better way, or we might have a parking problem, so we build more parking places, or we change the rates. So a regime is basically a context that we are all part of, and the ones that are professionally engaged are trying to, in general, make it better or make it less bad. So all we try to do is basically improve an existing system. And that's true for a lot of sectors in our economy, but also for urban fabrics. So what is a transition? A transition is basically regime change. Not a political regime, but a societal regime, as I described it just now. And it's basically the structural change of how we collectively think and organize and do over a very long period of time. So if I talk about the energy transition historically, we think in a time scale of decades. So it's an evolutionary process on the long term, or on the short term, but on the long term, it has a non-linear or revolutionary character. So the narrative of transitions, building on a lot of historical research, is that in a regime, most of the people are trying to improve things or optimize what is already there, while society around us is changing. So while we are asking for more sustainability or more solidarity, we try to make the cars more fuel efficient, or we might make the power plants less polluting. So we invest more and more in optimizing the existing, but what it does, it reduces diversity and resilience. So more and more, such a regime will become vulnerable for destabilization and disruption. Because at a certain point, it's impossible to make a fossil fuel car zero emission, for example. So that might lead to destabilization and ultimately disruption and chaos, collapse even. On the other hand, what also happens is that and often it starts when a regime is still quite stable, is that people start to experiment with alternatives. So they come up with new ideas, new concepts, new business models, new technologies. So while we are still at a policy level debating about efficiency of fossil fuel plants, engineers or entrepreneurs or change agents start with solar panels or with energy communities or with alternatives. Or while we are still thinking about improving the common agricultural policy and supporting the meat industry, people become vegetarian and start to think about slow food or about alternatives to the meat industry. And while at first, when a regime is still very dominant, so everybody thinks it's normal and that is how it goes, these experiments or these creatives are very alternative, literally. So people don't understand it, they're crazy, it's expensive. But over time, and often this is in co-evolution with what's happening in the regime level, these niches in our jargon, they can start to accelerate. More people join, prices go down, it starts to become more acceptable, more people start to think, we need maybe to take these alternatives more seriously. And what then happens is we see emerging alternative structures and markets. So For example, around if we take the energy system, energy cooperatives are now more and more a stable factor in our energy system and developing a position in at the European level in terms of negotiations, but also having their own contracts and communities and standards and so on. So what then can happen is, and that happens in the middle of this figure, is that if regimes really destabilize and more people within such a regime start to feel it doesn't work, we need to something else. There's a lot of tension brewing because also some people want to sustain the regime and maybe go back to stability and to the old regime. And there is emerging competition that can lead to very disruptive and unstable period of, let's say, a decade, where we see large-scale institutional change. And I hope most of you can sort of recognize this pattern. The interesting thing is this pattern is present in all sorts of scientific disciplines that use complex systems theory. So it's present in ecology or in physics or in evolutionary biology or in developmental psychology. It's the basic pattern of buildup of pressure and then a relatively short disruptive period of release. But when we apply this to society, it becomes much more ambiguous and it becomes much more interesting to me. So I think in many ways, we see that we are now in this turbulence, but we've been in such turbulence in the past before. Sometimes crises and wars play a role, or political turmoil, or visionary leadership. On the top right is Sikko Mansholt, a famous Dutch minister and later on also engineer of the European agricultural policy. He, after the Second World War, engineered the transition in agriculture, very strong vision. So we were very successful in the Netherlands with intensifying production, but it came at the expense of the environment. We also have strange transitions like the compact disc. Last year, more albums, records were sold in the Netherlands than compact disc again. Or we have failed transitions. At the top is Jimmy Carter in front of the White House in 1979. He was opening a field of solar panels in front of the White House. 3 days later, Ronald Reagan came into office, and the first act in his new job was to shut down this solar field, and that marked the start of decades of globalization, basically. So where are we now? And I think these are some pictures from the last couple of years that we interpret as the signs of destabilization. I think in many ways across our economy, in energy, in food, in healthcare, in mobility, in finance, we see increasing pressures from society. We see the inability to address these big persistent problems leads to increasing vulnerability and crises, heat waves, plastic pollution, which then mobilizes a lot of people to push policymakers to change. At the same time, we are somehow unable to make the changes, and then we see the crises in the finance system or in the mobility system, or things actually go wrong. And on top of that, the past year, we had this accelerator of this pandemic, which in many ways contributes to this instability and this destabilization of the economy that we have found so normal for the last decades. So an economy based on fossil energy and resources, on linear production and consumption, and on an extractive mode of operating when you look at it on a global scale. In many ways, it's exposing the vulnerability of the model that we have, and it's accelerating the destabilization of in a lot of sectors, but not in a straightforward way. because we see a lot of the countries are using the recovery funds to basically put the transitions that were unfolding on pause. So we are basically pausing a lot of the changes by using a lot of public money to save the existing and thus old economy. But what is also happening is that it triggers a lot of discussions and awareness with individuals, with organizations, that we need to change course. So the acceleration in terms of the mobilization of alternatives and the engagement of people with these alternatives is also growing. And that creates a very interesting mix and basically a platform for the next decade to really make substantial changes. So I would argue, yes, there is transition momentum, but there is also a lot of potential for negative transitions to happen. But I want to use the last 10 minutes for a positive story. So what can we do, and how can also you help increase the chances that we navigate this decade of transformative change towards a positive future? And the first thing to start with is where are these positive futures happening? And these are just some of the trends in food and energy mobility. You see the nice exponential curves that we know not so well now from COVID. But in terms of technological change, we see a lot of potential. These are some figures from a big EU project that we did, Transit, on social innovation. Also in the social domain, we see a lot of mobilization of transformative social innovations, so new ways of thinking and doing on a local scale when it comes to sustainable and just economies. Alternative currencies, alternative models of using and producing energy, mobility, and so on. These are just some examples, and the interesting thing is these labels are global networks of initiatives that are inherently local. So across the globe, millions of people are engaged in changing the food system, the finance system, the energy system, and so on. And they organize themselves in global networks through conferences, through handbooks. They share lessons, and we call that translocal. And one of the interesting things, of course, is that in this COVID pandemic, a lot of cities are working with these kinds of transformative social innovations, for example, to change their mobility system. So using the COVID momentum to increase the public space for pedestrians, green, and cycling. But that could be much more. Because that is my key argument today, that escaping this lock-in and this path dependency and somehow embracing this emerging diversity and seeing the potential of alternative futures that are not about improving the existing but reinventing the future, that is an ability that we have lost collectively. Policy making is focusing on solutions and improvement. Business is focusing on business models and their own and individual interests, and communities are also, to a large extent, more recipient or consumer of policy or what is happening. And I see an explosion of creativity, at least in my context in the Netherlands, where I look around me, but I also see a big need of the abilities of creatives, so the skills of design, but maybe also of transition, to start moving forward. And in transitions research, for this moving forward, we have formulated a number of principles. So what is the logic that we need to escape a regime? And at first, it requires the acknowledgement that we want to escape the regime. So we need a systemic mindset to understand the dynamics of transitions and to see also our own patterns of path dependency and regime. Somehow we are all part of regimes, but what we call reflexivity is the ability to zoom out and to look at the context and to recognize also the value of what is not there, what is out there. Then it requires a selective strategy so that we also leave our comfort zone and find new partnerships, new ideas, and focus on the ones that are also engaged in the transition that we want. That's the third point. The transition that we want is really about letting go of the existing and imagining or articulating desired futures, and using that as a starting point, and then we call that backcasting, to think backwards from the future, what it means for now. But also to put the experimentation or the learning in the now in the perspective of this long-term future. So in the end, what we try to articulate here, but also what we try to facilitate as researchers, but also what we try to teach to practitioners, is like a design-oriented form of development. And that is something that we need at a much larger scale than we have it now. And we use all sorts of instruments in transition management. We call it transition arenas or backcasting. I'm looking forward to the instruments that will come from the MESOC project. We develop all sorts of handbooks. They are important, but to me, much more important is how you develop them and the process of implementing these kinds of logics with practitioners to actually achieve impact. Because on the topics of MESOC, but in any contact that you have with communities or with policymakers, is a chance to enhance this transformative capacity. So for us, I was involved in the whole UNEP discussion. It's quite simple. There are all sorts of concepts out there, but in general, our future should be a future that is positive for people and the planet. And if you use that as a starting point for your backcasting, a lot of the things that we are doing now don't fit this perspective. So if you take such a long-term perspective, the next step, and this is sort of what we're now also implementing in our national post-COVID policies in the Netherlands, is that you need sort of this longer-term perspective and then have a much more strategic agenda with your partners about what needs to be built up, what are the alternatives, how can we change what we already have, and most importantly, perhaps for policymakers, is how can we start to phase out or stop doing what we don't want and what is contradicting this future that we want. This approach is also a way to escape the lock-in of policy or innovation policy, that sort of we do something next to the ongoing policies, but it's more of an add-on or an excuse. We need to also start to think about what we don't want anymore. So these are some pictures from our kind of action research practices. It's always people-oriented. So on the one hand, transition perspective is sort of an abstract theory, but what we try to do, and that's why some colleagues call us action or activist researchers, is that we try to use research projects, but also work with policymakers and organizations that take it seriously, to also take seriously these principles in practice. So it's about thinking selectively about who to engage. It's about a critical engagement with the existing regime. The existing regime is not working, so we need to challenge it and change it. So it's about trying to bring in creativity, design, academic knowledge into communities and into networks of policymakers and entrepreneurs to reinvent basically how we in this case, organize the city? Who owns the public space? How do we organize a maintenance of green areas? How do we change the mobility system so that it becomes just and clean? How do we increase participation of women or people with a migrant background in cycling, for example? These are the kind of challenges. And then, so we take a societal persistent problem, we challenge the regime, and then we mobilize the community of marginalized voices, perspectives, and ideas to create new narratives. And so that was a very quickly an example, maybe not clear enough, but maybe there's some 4 minutes to have a follow-up question. My final slide is about the need for reimagination. So I see a lot of the COVID recovery discussions are completely locked into saving economy, stabilization, and healthcare discussions. I see this huge momentum that has been building up for quite a long time already for transitions to a nature positive economy. And there's a lot of alternatives already there. These niches, these change agents, these social innovators, they are emerging, and they create value and impact in a different way. They might create impact by changing the world so that we don't do things anymore. They might create impact in a way that is more emotional or more social. And there's both a need to make visible and tangible what the value is that they create, but there's also a need to embed creativity and the strength of reimagination more in the dominant regime of how we shape our future. So the question I want to leave you with is the alternatives for positive futures are already there. How can we make them the norm? Both by exposing their value, but also by making them more important or maybe even dominant. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the discussions.